I wasn't supposed to be in the attic. Hell, I didn't even know we had one. In the 27 years I had drawn breath, the house I grew up in was a single-story ranch, a place of defined, finite spaces. There was my room, my parents' room, the living room where the TV droned, the kitchen that always smelled of my mother's cooking. There were no secret passages, no hidden depths. It was a house as plain and straightforward as the man who had owned it. Or so I had believed. My father, Robert Miller, was a creature of habit and quiet logic, an accountant who saw the world in columns of black and red. His death was the first illogical thing he had ever done, a sudden, brutal ledger entry that left the entire balance of my world in the negative. The funeral was a blur of casseroles, sympathetic murmurs, and the suffocating scent of lilies. But it was the will that truly unmoored me. Amidst dry, boilerplate language of asset allocation and beneficiary designations, a single, handwritten codicil stood out like a splash of blood on a clean sheet. It was his handwriting, the same precise, slightly cramped script from 1,000 birthday cards and signed permission slips, but it possessed a tremor I'd never seen before. It read, "Jonathan, burn what's in the attic. For your own sake. Don't open the file." The words hung in the sterile air of the lawyer's office, a complete non sequitur. The attic. What attic? My mother, when I asked, just shook her head, her face a mask of exhausted grief. She claimed to know nothing, her eyes darting away from mine as if the question itself were a betrayal. It was 2 days later, while clearing out my father's closet, that I found it. The closet was his inner sanctum, a space that smelled of old wool, cedar blocks, and the faint, crisp aroma of the starched shirts he wore every day. I was bagging up his suits for donation when my fingers, tracing the textured plaster of the ceiling, brushed against a faint, recessed line. A perfect square. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A thin cord, painted over to match the ceiling, dangled almost invisibly near the back wall. With trembling hands, I give it a pull. The sound that followed was a groan of ancient, protesting wood, a sound that didn't belong in our modern, meticulously maintained home. A set of folding wooden stairs draped in cobwebs as thick as cotton candy descended from the ceiling with a final, dusty sigh. The air that poured out of the opening above was different. It was thick, stagnant, and carried a smell I couldn't place. Not just dust, but something else. The smell of forgotten time. The will had been a command, a father's final desperate plea. Burn it. But it was also a hook, a lure dangled from beyond the grave. What secret did this house hold? What secret did my father, the man of numbers and reason, take with him? Up there in that black, waiting square was an answer, or perhaps a question I should never have asked. Among the ghosts of forgotten Christmas decorations and stacks of vinyl records that hadn't seen a needle in 30 years, sat a single, solitary object in the center of the dusty floorboards, as if placed on an altar. It wasn't a box or a trunk. It was a simple, sealed manila file folder. On the tab, written in that same shaky, urgent script, were 3 words that sealed my fate. Case 1049B. Closed. Incomplete. My father's last wish was to burn it. That thought echoed in the oppressive silence of the attic, a space that felt both a part of my home and profoundly alien to it. The good son in me, the one who still yearned for his father's approval, even after he was gone, knew what he had to do. Take the folder, walk it downstairs, and feed it to the flames in the hearth until it was nothing but gray ash and a wisp of smoke. It would be an act of faith, of final obedience. But my father was an accountant. He dealt with tax law, depreciation schedules, and quarterly reports. The most dramatic thing in his office was a red pen. What case? The word itself felt illicit, a piece of a foreign vocabulary smuggled into our quiet suburban life. The curiosity was more than a simple desire to know. It was a physical thing, a painful, itching pressure behind my eyes. I knelt on the creaking floorboards, the dust puffing up around my knees, and picked it up. The folder was cool to the touch, its surface slightly damp as if it were sweating. I broke the brittle, yellowed tape that sealed it. The sound was a sharp, definitive crack, the sound of a promise being broken. And then the smell hit me. It wasn't just the musty scent of old paper and mildew I had noticed before. This was something far more complex and visceral. It was a layered aroma, a foul potpourri of decay. There was the acid tang of aging chemicals, the kind you might find in a dark room. Beneath that was the dry, fibrous scent of brittle paper. But woven through it all was a coppery, sweetish undertone. It was a faint, almost subliminal note, but my hindbrain recognized it instantly. It was the smell of a wound that had long since healed over. The smell of old blood. My hands, now slick with a sudden cold sweat, fumbled with the contents. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Not crisp, glossy prints, but Polaroids, with their thick white borders and dreamlike, slightly faded colors. Each one had a date stamped in the bottom margin, the ink a faded blue. August 1986. September 1986. October 1986. All of them from the same year. A year that held no meaning for me. I wasn't a thought, not a dream. I wouldn't be born for another 7 years. I pulled out the first photo. It showed a small child, no older than 5 or 6 years old, sitting on a lawn of unnaturally green grass, holding a bright red ball. He was smiling, a wide, innocent grin that showed off a missing front tooth. His hair was a messy mop of brown, and a small, silvery, crescent-shaped scar was clearly visible just above his left eyebrow. My breath hitched in my throat. I dropped the photo as if it had burned me. I didn't need to check. I have a matching scar in the exact same spot, a permanent souvenir from a childhood fall off my bike. My own missing tooth, a baby tooth that never had an adult one grow in behind it, created the exact same gap in my smile to this day. I scrambled for another photo. Then another, the child on a swing set kicking his legs towards the sky, the child in a horrible green knitted jumper, the kind only a doting grandmother could love, the child wearing the t-shirt of a little league team I had played for. But these were all wrong. The clothes were mine, the face was mine, the scar was mine, but the time was not. I was looking at a ghost, a phantom who had lived my childhood before I ever had the chance to. In the deepest, most terrified corner of my soul, a single horrifying question began to form. Who was the original, and who was the copy? I'm not talking about a passing resemblance, the kind of thing that makes strangers on the street ask if you have a brother. This was not a doppelgänger. This was a carbon copy, a biological impossibility printed on fading Polaroid film. Every detail, every freckle, every cowlick in his unruly brown hair was an echo of my own youth. The tiny mole just to the left of his nose, the way his left ear stuck out just a fraction more than his right. These were my intimate, personal markers, the geography of my own face mapped onto a child who existed in a time before me. I stumbled out of the attic. The folder clutched to my chest like a shield, my lungs gasping for the clean, normal air of the hallway. The world felt tilted, the familiar angles of my home suddenly sharp and threatening. This had to be a joke, a prank. But who would orchestrate such a cruel, elaborate hoax? My father? The man who couldn't tell a joke to save his life? It was unthinkable. My mother was in the kitchen, staring blankly into a cup of tea. She looked smaller since he'd died, as if his absence had physically diminished her. I approached her carefully, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Mom," I began, my voice hoarse, "I found something in the attic." Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. Fear? Annoyance?
She just shook her head again. "There is no attic, Johnny. The heat gets to you." It was a dismissal. A door slammed in my face. But I persisted. I took out one of the photos, the one with the gap-toothed smile, and laid it on the table in front of her. "Look at this," I pleaded. "Just look at it." She stared at the photo, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a shadow of a memory, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a stony, almost hostile confusion. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice thin and brittle. This is a nice picture of you, but I've never seen it before. We never had a Polaroid camera." "Mom, look at the date," I insisted, my voice rising with a frantic edge. "It says 1986. I wasn't born until 93. Who is this?" She pushed the photo away from her, as if it were contaminated. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp with an unfamiliar edge. "It's a misprint, a mistake. You're upsetting yourself over nothing." But her eyes told a different story. They were wide with terror she was desperately trying to conceal. She wasn't looking at me, but through me, as if seeing a ghost standing over my shoulder. "You weren't born until 93, she repeated, the words a desperate mantra. "You are my son. You were born at St. Mary's Hospital on May 14th, 1993. She was reciting facts, clinging to them like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. She was trying to convince not me, but herself. The conversation was over. She stood up, rinsed her cup in the sink with trembling hands, and left the room, leaving me alone with the impossible photograph and the chilling certainty that my own mother was lying to me, or worse, lying to herself about the very nature of my existence. The Polaroids were just the beginning, the unnerving prelude to a far more terrifying symphony. Beneath them, the folder contained a sheaf of typed pages held together by a rusting paperclip. The paper was thin and onion-skinned, the type used for carbon copies in an age before printers. The letterhead at the top of the first page read, "Meadowbrook County Sheriff's Department." I'd never heard of the place. A quick search on my phone revealed it was a small, rural county 3 states away, a place we had no connection to. The documents were a cold, bureaucratic litany of a tragedy. Police reports, witness testimonies, and forensic analyses, all typed with the detached, clinical precision of law enforcement. And as I read, the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was a missing person report. Case file 1049B. The name of the victim was listed at the top of the first page. Jonathan Miller. Age 6. My name. My age in the photographs. The report detailed his last known whereabouts with chilling clarity. Subject was last seen at approximately 4:15 p.m. on October 12, 1986, walking toward the tree line bordering the western edge of Meadowbrook Lake Park. He was wearing blue jeans, a red t-shirt, and white sneakers. He was carrying a red rubber ball. The ball from the photograph. The report continued, its dispassionate language making the content even more grotesque. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses to an abduction. One moment the child was there, a flash of red against the green of the park. The next he was gone, swallowed by the woods. The final sentence of the summary report was a punch in the gut. After extensive search and rescue operations yielded no results, the subject is presumed deceased. I was reading my own obituary, written 7 years before I was born. Tucked between the pages of witness statements, neighbors who described the boy as quiet and a bit of a loner, was a sketch. It was a composite, drawn from the vague descriptions of a park-goer who thought they saw a man standing near the woods that day. The sketch was rough, done in charcoal, but the likeness was unmistakable. The square jaw, the high forehead, the intense, deep-set eyes, it was a perfect, haunting likeness of my father in his late 20s. He was there. He was watching. Why? Was he a suspect? A witness? The file offered no answers, only deeper, darker questions. The final page of the report was a supplemental note, added a month after the disappearance. It was from the lead detective. Case remains open but inactive. No leads. It's as if the child simply ceased to exist. One final peculiar note: the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, refused to provide any recent photographs of their son for the public appeal. They claimed they didn't have any. They became uncooperative and moved from the county shortly after the search was called off. My grandparents? I'd been told they died in a car accident before I was born. Every part of my life, every story I had been told was beginning to unravel, revealing a horrifying, rotten core beneath the comfortable facade of my reality. The file wasn't just about a missing boy. It was about me. And my father, the quiet accountant, was standing right at the dark, silent center of it all. I spent the next few hours in a clinical obsession, the grief for my father momentarily eclipsed by a frantic, analytical terror. I laid the Polaroids out on the dining room table like a detective mapping a crime scene, the smiling face of the boy, of me, staring up from a dozen different moments in a life I'd never lived. I told myself it was a coincidence, a string of terrible, statistically impossible coincidences. Some other Jonathan Miller with some other parents who looked like my grandparents, who happened to have a son who was my exact duplicate, who disappeared in a town where my father, for some unknown reason, happened to be. It was a house of cards built on madness, but it was the only thing shielding me from the abyss. I needed to find a flaw, a crack in the narrative. I began to examine the photos not for the subject, but for the background, the periphery. I used a magnifying glass, the one my father kept for reading the fine print on contracts. I scanned each photo, pixel by faded grain, searching for anything out of place. Most were clean: a suburban yard, a chain-link fence, a public park. But then I came to the photo of the boy on the swing set. He's midair, legs kicked high, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. Behind him, beyond the manicurable lawn, was a dense wall of trees. A forest. My breath fogged the magnifying glass. I wiped it clean. The police report had said that he was last seen walking toward the woods. I leaned in closer, my nose almost touching the glossy surface of the Polaroid. The trees were a dark, undifferentiated mass of green and brown, but deep within them, where the shadows were thickest, I saw it. It wasn't a face. It wasn't even a clear shape. It was just a patch of darkness that was darker than the others, a subtle vertical line that didn't belong, the hint of a shoulder, the faint suggestion of a human form half hidden behind a thick pine. It was the kind of detail you would never notice unless you were looking for it with the desperation of a drowning man. It was nothing. A trick of the light. Pareidolia. My mind, straining under the pressure, was manufacturing monsters from shadows. I was about to dismiss it, to move on to the next photo, when my eyes caught on something else. A tiny fleck of color on the dark shape. A pale beige-brown. I used my phone, snapping a high-resolution picture of the Polaroid and zooming in until the image dissolved into a mosaic of chemical grain, and there it was. A collar. a pale, fleece-lined collar on a dark canvas jacket. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. I stumbled back from the table and ran to my bedroom closet. I pushed past my own clothes until my fingers found the rough, familiar fabric. I pulled it out. The canvas jacket that my father had left me. His favorite. The one he wore every autumn. It was heavy, smelling of wood smoke and him, and its color, a thick band of fleece, was the exact same shade of worn beige-brown. The man in the police sketch was my father. The man in the trees, the silent, watching figure lurking at the edge of a happy childhood moment, was wearing my father's jacket. Coincidence was no longer a shield. It was a joke.
He wasn't just a witness to this boy's life. He was an observer, a stalker, hiding in the shadows. The question was no longer just who this boy was, it was what my father was doing there, and why he had kept this secret hidden away in the dark for 30 years. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely function. The file folder lay on the table, a Pandora's box I couldn't close. At the very bottom, stuck to the cardboard by a smear of old adhesive, was one last item. It was a microcassette, the kind journalists and private investigators used in the 80s. It was tiny, almost insignificant, its clear plastic casing holding 2 miniature spools of dark, glistening tape. There was no label. Of course there wasn't. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the frantic drumming of my own heart. I didn't own anything that could play this. The technology was obsolete, a fossil from a dead era. A frantic online search and a 2-hour drive to a dusty, cluttered electronics repair shop run by an old man who seemed as ancient as the technology he serviced, and I finally had a player. It was a clunky silver device, heavy in my hand. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, the player in front of me, the tiny cassette held between my thumb and forefinger. This felt like a final transgression. The photos and reports were one thing. This was a voice from the past, from the heart of the mystery. This was my father's secret, and I was about to listen in. With a shaking hand, I pushed the cassette into the player. The click of the door closing sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I pressed the play button. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft, mechanical whir of the spindles turning, followed by the loud, abrasive hiss of blank tape. I was about to give up, to think it was empty, when the hiss was broken by a sound. A man clearing his throat, and then a voice I knew as well as my own, but different, younger, higher, and stretched thin with a terror so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. It was my father. "Log entry 1, he whispered, his voice dry and cracking. "I don't know what this thing is. I followed the protocol. I did everything they said, but it came back. It came back from the woods." A long pause, filled with the sound of a ragged, shuddering breath. "It's growing. Every night it looks more like him. It has his smile. It knows his name. But the eyes, God, the eyes are all wrong. They're like doll's eyes. Empty. It mimics him, but it isn't him. It isn't human." The tape hissed for a few seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a page turning. My father's voice returned, lower now, a conspiratorial whisper, as if he was afraid of being overheard even in his own solitude. "The original is gone. I saw it happen. But this copy,
They sent it too soon. They weren't supposed to send it yet. It's not ready. It's not right. The words made no sense, but they carried an undeniable weight of conviction. The original, the copy, they. Who were they? What protocol was he talking about? Before I could process the implications, the recording changed. The hushed, terrified voice of my father was replaced by a new sound. It was the sound of a child humming, a simple, tuneless melody. It was a sound that should have been innocent, but in the context of my father's terror, it was monstrous. It was the sound of the thing he was describing. The humming grew louder, closer, and then the tape ended with an abrupt, violent click, plunging the room back into a silence that was now heavier, more menacing than ever before. The voice on the tape replayed in my mind, a horrifying, endless loop. The original is gone. This copy, they sent it too soon. The words shattered the last vestiges of any rational explanation. This wasn't a case of a missing child or a secret adoption. This was something else entirely. Something that skirted the edges of science fiction and cosmic horror. My father wasn't just a witness. He was a participant, a man following a protocol from an unknown they. The file had one last secret to yield. Tucked into the back flap, on a grease-stained napkin from a diner I didn't recognize, was a map. It was scribbled in red pencil, the lines faded and smudged. It wasn't a professional map, but a rough hand-drawn sketch of a plot of land, with landmarks like Split Rock and Creek Bed noted in my father's handwriting. At the center of the map was a large, crudely drawn oak tree, with a large X marking a spot at its base. The most chilling detail was the title he'd written at the top, Contingency. I recognized the layout of the land. It was the woods behind the house I grew up in, the house my parents bought in 1992, a year before I was born, the house my mother still lived in. The next day, armed with a shovel from the garage, I drove to my childhood home. My mother was out at her weekly bridge game. The woods felt different now. What was once a place of childhood adventure, of forts and imaginary kingdoms, now felt sinister, its shadows deep and watchful. I found the old oak tree easily. It was a massive, ancient thing, its branches like gnarled arms reaching for the sky. Following the map, I found the spot marked with the X, and I began to dig. The ground was soft, thick with years of fallen leaves and damp earth. The work was grueling. Sweat poured down my face, mingling with the dirt. An hour passed, then two. My muscles screamed in protest. I was about to give up, to write it off as another dead end, when the tip of my shovel struck something hard, with a dull, hollow thud. Not a rock. Wood. My heart hammering, I dug frantically with my hands, pulling away the damp soil to reveal the top of a small, rotting wooden box. It was the size of a shoebox, its wood dark and waterlogged. The lid wasn't nailed shut. It lifted off easily. The smell that emerged was one of damp earth and profound decay. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like yellowed, crumbling cloth, were three objects. The first was a pair of child's glasses, the frames thick and black, the kind I associated with pictures from the 1950s. One of the lenses was cracked clean across. My vision is, and has always been, a perfect 2020. The second object was a single child's shoe, a simple canvas sneaker caked in dried mud and stiff with age. It was a size I would have worn at 6 years old, but it was a brand I'd never owned. The third object made me recoil in horror. It was a small, clear plastic baggie, the kind used for jewelry. And inside, resting on a tiny piece of cotton, was a cracked baby tooth. I have all my baby teeth. My mother kept them in a small velvet-lined box in her jewelry case. I knew this for a fact. This box wasn't evidence of a missing child. It was a burial plot. A grave containing the relics of a life that was almost mine, but wasn't. It was a contingency, a backup plan, a collection of proof that the original Jonathan Miller was gone. The drive back from my childhood home was a blur. The contents of the buried box sat on the passenger seat, a grotesque parody of my own history. The glasses, the shoe, the tooth, each one a silent testament to the boy I apparently had replaced. My mind was a maelstrom of fractured theories. A secret twin? A kidnapping? A bizarre experiment orchestrated by the mysterious they my father mentioned on the tape? I needed an outside perspective.
I needed someone who wasn't my mother, who wasn't tangled in this web of lies. I needed a witness. And then I remembered Mrs. Gable. She had lived in the house across the street for 50 years. She was a permanent fixture of the neighborhood, a woman whose memory was as sharp as her tongue. She had watched me grow up, from a toddler on a tricycle to a teenager learning to drive. If anyone had seen something, it would be her. I found her tending her roses, her back bent with age but her movements still precise. I approached her cautiously, holding a photo of myself from 1996, taken at my 3rd birthday party. It was one of the few photos that felt safe, that felt real. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice strained, "do you remember this?" She squinted at the photo, a slow smile spreading across her wrinkled face. "Oh, of course, Johnny. Your 3rd birthday. You had that cowboy-themed party. You were so cute. You and that little cousin of yours were running yourselves ragged through the sprinkler." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Cousin?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have any cousins, Mrs. Gable, not that look like me, anyway." She waved a dismissive gloved hand. "Oh, nonsense. Everyone has cousins. He looked just like you. A little mirror image. Only saw him that one time, though. Your parents said he was just visiting for the week." My blood ran cold. I pressed, my voice strained. You only saw him once? Are you sure?" She paused, her smile fading as she dredged up the memory. "Yes, I think so. Just that one day." She looked off into the distance, her eyes unfocused. "Funny thing, though, now that I think about it, it was such a bright, sunny day, one of the hottest of the year. The sun was just beating down on you two as you were playing on the lawn." She turned back to me, her gaze sharpening, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she shared the strange, forgotten secret. "I remember thinking it was odd. A little trick of the light, I suppose." I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. "What was odd, Mrs. Gable?" Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw a flicker of ancient, superstitious fear. "Well," she said, leaning in closer, "it was a bright, sunny day, but only one of you cast a shadow." Mrs. Gable's words followed me home, a chilling whisper that clung to the air. Only one of you cast a shadow. The statement was so absurd, so folkloric that it should have been laughable. Instead, it felt like the final logical piece of an insane puzzle. I returned to my apartment, a space that had once been my sanctuary, but now felt as alien and threatening as the attic. The file folder was still on my table, a stain of yellowed manila against the dark wood. I was exhausted, my mind frayed and worn thin from the constant assault on my reality. I thought I had seen everything. I thought the file had given up all its ghosts. I was wrong. As I began to gather the scattered documents, intending to follow my father's final wish and burn them all, one last photograph slipped from under the folder's folded flap and fluttered to the floor. It landed face down. I knelt to pick it up, my movements slow and weary. It felt different from the others. The cardstock was thicker, glossier. The edges were sharp, not rounded with age. I flipped it over, and the world fell away. This was not a faded, dreamlike image from 1986. The colors were sharp, vibrant, and terrifyingly contemporary. It was a photograph of me, not the child, but me, as I am now. I was asleep in my own bed, the blue of my comforter a vivid slash across the frame. It was an image of absolute vulnerability. But it was the angle that made my blood freeze. The photograph was taken from the foot of my bed, looking down at me. It was a perspective that was impossible. I live alone. I bolt my door every night. No one has a key. And then I saw the date stamp in the bottom right corner, printed in crisp digital orange font. Aug 1, 2025. 3 days ago. A cold dread, far deeper and far more absolute than anything I had felt before, washed over me. This wasn't about the past anymore. The threat wasn't a ghost from 1986. It was here, now. It had been in my room. It had watched me sleep. It had stood at the foot of my bed, close enough to hear me breathe, and it had taken a picture, a souvenir, proof of its access, its proximity. The man in the trees had stepped out of the woods, and he had found his way to my door. I was still on my knees, the photograph trembling in my hand, my mind struggling to process the sheer impossibility of it. The silence in my apartment was suddenly deafening. It felt charged, expectant. That's when it happened. From the kitchen table, a sound. A sharp, mechanical click. I looked up. The old microcassette player had just switched itself on. The play button was depressed, as if pushed by an invisible finger. The whir of the spindle started, and the familiar loud hiss filled the room. The hiss continued for a few seconds, an eternity of static. And then my father's voice erupted from the tiny speaker. No longer a hushed whisper, but a frantic, desperate shout, distorted by the volume. "It found you, Jonathan. It found you. It will try to replace you. You have to burn the file. Burn everything. Don't let it in the house. Don't let it in." His voice cut off mid-scream. The hiss vanished. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. It was a heavy, predatory silence. And then a new sound began. It came from right beside me. A soft scratching sound, like a fingernail being dragged across a wooden floor. I was frozen, a statue of pure terror. The scratching stopped, and a voice whispered. A dry, sibilant rustle of sound that seemed to come from inside my own ear. Too late. The voice was not my father's. It was ancient and dry, the sound of dust and decay given life. It whispered again, "He is already inside." The two words echoed in the cavern of my skull, already inside. The photograph wasn't a threat of a future visit. It was a memento of a visit that had already happened. The entity wasn't trying to get in. It was already here, with me, in the suffocating intimacy of my apartment. The whisper was a declaration of victory. The game was over before I even knew I was playing. I scrambled backwards, my back hitting the wall with a hard thud. My eyes darted around the room searching the shadows, but there was nothing. Just me, my furniture, and the suffocating certainty that I was not alone. My mind, in a desperate bid for survival, latched onto the words. It mimics him, a little mirror image. He's already inside. The pronoun was a sliver of hope. He, not you. It implied a separation, a duality. There was a me, and there was a he.
I had to prove it. I had to prove I was still me. I lurched to my feet and stumbled into the bathroom, my hand slapping against the wall until I found the light switch. The fluorescent light flickered on with a hum, bathing the small room in a harsh, sterile glare. I gripped the edges of the sink, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look up, to face the mirror.
My own face stared back at me. It was pale, my eyes wide with terror, my hair a mess. It was me. I blinked. The reflection blinked. I raised my right hand. The reflection raised its left. A perfect, instantaneous mirror. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made my knees buckle, washed over me. It was me. I was real. But the relief was short-lived, poisoned by my father's warning. It mimics. A perfect mimic would pass a simple test. I had to be smarter. I remembered something from a psychology class, a test for certain neurological disorders. I stared into my own eyes in the mirror, forcing myself to hold my own gaze. I focused on a single point, the tiny mole to the left of my nose, and I held it. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just stared, my eyes burning, tears beginning to well up and blur the image. The goal was to break the feedback loop, to catch the mimic in a moment of lag, a fractional delay between my action and its reaction. Seconds stretched into an eternity. My lungs burned for air. My eyes screamed for the relief of a blink. The face in the mirror remained perfectly still, a perfect copy of my own strained expression. It was working. Or rather, it wasn't. There was no flaw. It was me. I was about to give up, to surrender to the comforting illusion of sanity, when I saw it. It wasn't a lag in movement. It was something far more subtle. As a tear finally escaped my right eye and traced a path down my cheek, the tear on the reflection's face began not from the eye, but seemed to materialize a millimeter below it, a tiny, impossible bead of water that then traced the exact same path. It was a microscopic imperfection, a painter's flaw, a stitch dropped in the tapestry of its mimicry. My heart stopped. I kept staring, my mind now hyper-aware, searching for another flaw. And then it happened. While my own face remained a mask of slack-jawed horror, the reflection's corners of the mouth began to twitch upwards. Slowly, deliberately, the mouth in the mirror curled into a smile. It was not my smile. It was a wide, predatory grin, full of an ancient, knowing malice. It was the smile of the thing that had won. The smile in the mirror broke me. I shattered the medicine cabinet with my fist, sending glass and pills scattering across the floor, and fled the bathroom, fled the reflection. But there is no escape from a mirror when the thing it reflects is no longer you. The days that followed have been a slow, quiet descent into a new kind of hell. The overt terror has been replaced by something far worse, a creeping, insidious uncertainty that infects every thought, every memory. The entity is no longer showing off. The blatant displays have stopped. The mimicry is perfect now. Too perfect. Every time I look in the mirror, the reflection is flawless, instantaneous. But I know it's just gotten better at the game. It's a more practiced liar. The real horror is the subtle corruption of my own self. I lose time. I'll be reading a book, and suddenly I'll wake up an hour later, the book on the other side of the room, with no memory of moving. I'll find half-eaten meals in the kitchen I don't remember making. The other day, I answered my phone, and the person on the other end, my boss, asked why I was calling him back when he'd just left me a voicemail. I hadn't called him. I hadn't even heard my phone ring. I listened to my own voicemail greeting, the one I recorded years ago. My voice sounds wrong. It's me, but it's not me. The pitch is slightly higher, the cadence cleaner, more precise.
It's the voice of someone pretending to be me, someone who has studied the script but doesn't understand the music. My memories are beginning to fray at the edges. I remember my 10th birthday party, but was the cake chocolate or vanilla? I seem to have both memories at once, flickering back and forth like a faulty light. I remember my first kiss, but the girl's face is becoming indistinct, blurring into a generic template of a face. The real memories, my memories, are being overwritten, replaced with inferior copies. The file is still here, on my desk. My father's last wish was for me to burn it, to destroy the evidence, to erase the history of the thing that was hunting me. I should do it. It feels like the only sane act left to perform. But a new thought, a new memory that doesn't feel like my own holds me back. It's a cold, logical thought, a thought that whispers of self-preservation at any cost. The file isn't just a history. It's a manual. It's a record of the original's disappearance. It's proof. I sit here, in the quiet of my apartment, the line between myself and the other blurring with every passing second. I feel its thoughts bleeding into mine, its cold logic seeping into my fear. And the most terrifying question of all begins to surface, a question that I am no longer sure is mine to ask. If I'm the copy, why do I remember burning the original?